everybody, and welcome to Psyched Out, a podcast focused on all things psychology, like psychological thrillers, unethical experiments, true crime, cults, and more. I am your host, Emily, and for those who don't know, I have a bachelor's degree in forensic psychology and a background in law enforcement. This helps me provide unique insight on some of the world's most famous cases, movies, and events. In today's episode, we'll be talking about something called Jerusalem Syndrome. Before we jump in, though, I do want to talk about some scheduling things. Next week, there will not be an episode. I will be out of town celebrating my birthday with friends and family, so I'll be taking a little bit of me time, so there will not be an episode. I do apologize if that disappoints you, but I am a human being, and I would like to spend time with my family. My dog is sort of flipping his shit at the moment, so if you hear him being weird in the background, just know he's alive and well, but he's decided that when mom sits down to record, it's time to lose my mind in typical child fashion. I am working on rewatching Hannibal for a second time to complete my analysis, so that will be an episode, so stay tuned for that if that's something that interests you. And I think that's about everything I have on the scheduling side of things. I don't think I have anything else. Let me just run through my mental Rolodex. And nope, I think that's pretty much it. So, we're going to get back to the episode and have ourselves a pretty fantastic time. If you have never heard of a disease that affects someone's psyche so much they become a physical representation of popular biblical figures like Jesus, Paul, or Simon, don't worry, I had neither until somewhat recently, and I found out that it's called Jerusalem Syndrome. And Jerusalem Syndrome is a disease not recognized in the DSM-5, and really quick for those who don't know, the DSM-5 is a diagnostic material that is used to help diagnose people with mental illness and things like that. It is what a lot of psychologists, psychiatrists go by, and it basically breaks down like, hey, this is how depression works. Hey, this is how schizophrenia works. Hey, this is how that works. And so Jerusalem Syndrome in and of itself is not formally recognized as a mental illness or anything like that, so just keep that in mind. However, it is a documented phenomenon. And the interesting part is that it still persists and affects people of multiple nationalities, religions, and genders. It is very non-discriminate, which is particularly interesting with something like this. So what exactly is Jerusalem Syndrome? How do you catch it? And if you catch it, is it fixable? If you stick around through this episode, all of your questions will be answered. And while you're at it, if you're on the YouTube side of things, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you're on the podcast side of things, don't forget to review and subscribe as well. It means a lot. It lets me know that you guys actually like this content, and it puts a little smile on my face, so thanks. As the name implies, Jerusalem Syndrome, also sometimes called Jerusalem disease, originated in Jerusalem. I know. It's shocking. And it's considered a group disorder because it can be experienced by anyone who visits the city. Simply put, the disease is a mental phenomenon that involves religiously obsessive ideas, delusions, psychosis, and other similar symptoms. The disease itself was first described in the 1930s by a psychologist in Jerusalem, Heinz Hermann, who became one of the founders for psychological research specifically in Jerusalem. So shout out to Big Heinz. Appreciate your work. Nice job, dude. Some argue that while the phenomenon is named Jerusalem Syndrome, it's actually occurred in other religious places such as Mecca or Rome, and it's been around approximately as long, it's been around since the Middle Ages. Some documented accounts of people who experienced the, it's called Jerusalem Syndrome, but like I said, it affects other religious places and things like that, so I'm just going to call it Jerusalem Syndrome. Some people who have experienced Jerusalem Syndrome would be that of Felix Fabry and Marjorie Kemp. And for those who don't know, Felix Fabry was a Swiss Dominican theologian who created detailed descriptions of his religious pilgrimages to different areas. He's suspected to have experienced this. And Marjorie Kemp was a Christian mystic, presumably plagued by visions and called to be more intimate with Christ than other religious individuals. Essentially, she was able to converse with God in ways that others weren't. Her visions and episodes were said to be so severe that it affected her physical senses and caused her to hear disembodied music or smell unknown smells. And as cool as this sounds, it's more likely that Marjorie Kemp suffered from mental illness and psychosis, but who knows? Maybe she was actually talking to God. I just think that it's pretty unlikely that it was in the severity that she claimed it was. But yes, Marjorie Kemp and Felix Fabry are two documented instances of individuals who have been said to experience Jerusalem syndrome. And like I said, this goes way, way, way back to the Middle Ages, which I think is really interesting. And it kind of provides some context and background to Jerusalem syndrome in the modern era. But like I said, we're going to talk specifically about Jerusalem syndrome in the sense that it's in Jerusalem. So while I referred to other places and instances of Jerusalem syndrome, you know what I mean. You know what? It's just going to get complicated. So anyways, we're going to focus specifically on the Jerusalem syndrome of Jerusalem, if that makes sense. Anywho, some psychologists argue that Jerusalem syndrome specifically affects those with underlying conditions, namely mental health problems. And this is still under debate because it's hard to document whether or not people affected by the syndrome had prior diagnoses or not. In any given instance, it's possible someone is completely normal cognitively, or they simply didn't know that they had some type of mental illness. Maybe it was something like anxiety instead of something more severe like schizophrenia. This means, unfortunately, that we'll likely never have a true answer as to whether or not Jerusalem syndrome kind of resides within one specific group of people, one specific mental illness, if there's other confounding factors, different things like that. So it's a little bit complicated. And because of this, Jerusalem syndrome presents itself in a few different ways, which also lends to its complexity and overall difficulty in being studied because it's never going to show itself specifically in the same way in every single person. To help streamline an understanding of Jerusalem syndrome, I looked up a synopsis that says, quote, "The classic Jerusalem syndrome occurs when a visit to Jerusalem triggers an intense religious psychosis that resolves quickly after or on departure," end quote. The syndrome itself doesn't appear to last for extensive periods of time, but there are enough differences within Jerusalem syndrome as a whole that there are 3 types of Jerusalem syndrome, and then within those types there are subtypes. So we're going to dive into those and break that down. Type 1 is described as Jerusalem syndrome, which is imposed on a previous psychotic illness. In other words, this type of Jerusalem syndrome affects those diagnosed or predisposed to psychotic disorders who go to Jerusalem due to religious ideas, religious missions, or another goal in mind. And due to the extensive religious presence surrounding Jerusalem, type 1 Jerusalem syndrome sufferers adopt aspects of Christian religion, believing they are specific biblical figures or can cause specific biblical events, such as the second coming of Christ. Now, type 1 subtype 1 is listed as a psychotic identification with biblical characters. Individuals who suffer this subtype identify with biblical characters from the Old and New Testament, so much so that they themselves believe they're these biblical characters like manifested in the flesh. Interestingly, Jewish tourists seem to identify more with Old Testament biblical characters, while Christians tend to identify with New Testament characters. Additionally, men and women tend to identify with biblical characters of the same gender. In one particular representation of this subtype, a man in his 40s identified with the biblical figure of Samson. Those who don't know, Samson was a super big, strong guy who had power basically in his hair. When it got cut, he ended up losing all of his strength. It was cut by Delilah, who was his lover. She basically betrayed him. He ended up dying by sacrificing himself. It was a whole thing. That's kind of the gist of the story. I'm probably not doing it a whole lot of justice, but you can definitely look it up. Very, very interesting story. But yeah, this guy identified with Samson. And this was a result of his physical fitness journey, which eventually morphed into an intense compulsion to go visit Israel and prove he was Samson to those around him by moving a large piece of stone in the Wailing Wall that he claimed was misplaced. This man was consequently arrested and placed in a hospital following the commotion of his attempted stone removal. And when a psychiatrist told the man he wasn't Samson, the man became so angry that he broke a window and escaped the hospital, where he was later found at a bus stop by a student nurse. Smarter than the psychiatrist on staff, she told the man he'd proven himself to be Samson and that he should return to the hospital, which he did on his own accord. From there, he was given antipsychotics after being assessed. His psychotic state eased, and he was able to fly home under the supervision of his father. Yeah, he obviously got arrested because you can't just, go desecrate, historical monuments like the Wailing Wall. But just very interesting that he fully believed, like, hey, I am this biblical character. And as the story indicates, this was kind of a manifestation of his own belief system, being like, hey, I'm this big, strong guy. I'm on a health and wellness journey. Samson was known to be incredibly strong. It's like the focal point of his Bible story. So it's just a very neat manifestation of Jerusalem syndrome. Next, we have type 1, subtype 2, which is listed as individuals who strongly identify with an idea based on a religious nature. In one instance, a Protestant South American concocted a plan to travel to Jerusalem and destroy Muslim holy places and religious structures in order to replace them with Jewish structures and holy places. From there, this individual would start the war of Gog and Magog, leading to the birth of the Antichrist and the second coming of Jesus. After successfully ruining a holy mosque in Jerusalem, the man was admitted to a hospital and later transferred to a mental health institution in his home country. This one is a little bit interesting because to me, it sounds mostly like terrorism, at least in this example. Because it says that it's people who strongly identify with an idea based on a religious nature. I wouldn't have exactly picked this instance to represent that subtype. However, when you Google, instances for type 1, subtype 2, this is probably the most common one that shows up. So I wonder if, yes, he did have Jerusalem syndrome issues, but also was based on, like, racism and Islamophobia and a bunch of other issues that just manifested in, like, a really bad way. So I'm kind of surprised that that's the example being used, but here we are. Type 1 subtype 3 is listed as medical ideas regarding health in connection to holy places. For instance, people with horrible illnesses firmly believe that visiting Jerusalem will heal them of any ailment they possess. Interestingly, a man from the mid-1800s, known as the writer Gorgal, that sounds like an evil wizard, was one of these individuals. After losing his ability to write, he firmly believed that going to Jerusalem and reciting prayers in holy places would heal him, restoring his ability to write. This idea consumed him, but it didn't work, and he later reportedly starved himself to death. That is incredibly sad and depressing, but honestly, I kind of understand the appeal. At a certain point, as a Christian myself, prayer is very, very comforting, but sometimes it feels like prayer doesn't always work. So it could boil down to the sentiment of, well, if I go here where there's a lot of holy energy and a lot of, historical presence of, like, Christian history, it might work better. It's honestly just a manifestation of desperation, presented specifically in religious ideology and faith. And I can't really blame the guy for trying. It is sad, though, that he got very depressed and just starved himself to death. But he wouldn't be the first individual who had this idea, and he wouldn't be the last. I know a lot of people that go to Jerusalem, not personally, but I've heard a lot of stories of people who go to Jerusalem thinking, like, hey, this will solve this type of illness for me. It'll clear my mental health. It'll clear cancer. It'll do all sorts of stuff. And the sad reality is that it most likely won't. If it does, fantastic. Like, miracles do happen. But realistically, it's likely not the case. Type 1 subtype 4 is listed as family problems culminating in psychosis in Jerusalem. The description for this subtype listed in Bar-El et al., this is a study, is a little confusing to understand, so I'm going to summarize it as best as I can. When people with mental illness attend Jerusalem, their psychosis can manifest into creating non-existent family problems. Alternatively, the psychosis can exacerbate family problems that already exist, and the people that fit within the subtype often go to Jerusalem multiple times thinking that the holy place is either the cause of these problems or the solution to these problems. An example of this subtype occurred when a South African man diagnosed with bipolar disorder and with a history of hospital visits due to his mental health visited Jerusalem. His reason for visiting was to kill a man that had reportedly raped his daughter. With a warning from his family to Jerusalem authorities, the man was placed in hospital upon arrival and was promptly treated for his psychosis. After his mental state study, he was able to understand the fact that his mental state had been manic and that he actually didn't intend on killing anyone in Jerusalem, that his daughter had never been raped, and that he was actually thinking of his son-in-law, who he had no issues with and actually admired. Interestingly, this wasn't the first time the man had sought out Jerusalem to solve his manic episodes that often created distortions of his family life and family dynamics. It's still unclear why people like him are even drawn to Jerusalem to overcome these types of episodes, but it definitely happens. This is a pretty niche subtype, in my opinion. This isn't something that you hear about very often, but it kind of makes sense to a certain extent. But this is definitely one of those instances where mental health pairs with Jerusalem syndrome, and that it kind of affects people who have predisposed conditions. Now we're going to get into type 2, which is described as Jerusalem syndrome superimposed on and complicated by idiosyncratic ideas. This version pertains to individuals that don't suffer psychosis or underlying mental illness, but are heavily religious individuals who put a lot of importance, emotion, and spiritual energy into the significance of Jerusalem. This can lead to obsessions surrounding Jerusalem as their ideas and beliefs are heightened by the energy within Jerusalem. Type 2, subtype 1, is defined as individuals who belong to a group. This subtype doesn't contain one specific example, but is best explained as follows. Individuals who fit into this subtype are usually part of small Christian groups outside of the mainstream denominations of Christianity. The groups rarely consist of more than 20 people and often make their homes in or around Jerusalem. They do this to try and bring forth the second coming of Christ or trigger other biblical events. Many of these groups and members wear clothing that's supposed to resemble accurate representations of clothing in the Bible. On top of these niche Christian groups, a handful of Jewish-based groups, at least 3, exist in and around Jerusalem as well. Their intentions are to create a red heifer. It is believed that sacrificing a pure red heifer can be used for purification rituals that allows individuals to enter the temple. A pure red heifer has yet to be conceived. In most cases, these individuals don't undergo psych evaluations as they are overall harmless and they don't really pose a threat to anybody around them. Type 2 subtype 2 is a classification for lone individuals, wherein a single person becomes obsessed with Jerusalem and its religious implications. Similar to the grouping subtype listed above, it's different in the sense that it's a lone wolf. For example, a 45-year-old German man working in academics became obsessed with finding what he called the, quote, true religion, but was disappointed regardless of the religion he studied. He ultimately decided that, quote, primitive Christianity, end quote, was the true religion and became obsessed with spreading the word, specifically through Jerusalem. This led to a violent altercation, and the man still clings to this obsession. And when studied by local psychologists, they found absolutely nothing wrong with him, not even a personality disorder. All he had was his obsession with true religion and Jerusalem. And he himself is a lone individual not acting within the group mindset of subtype 1. Overall, relatively harmless, except these obsessions, when challenged, can maybe lead to violent acts. Subtype 3 is described as Jerusalem syndrome as a discrete form, uncompounded by previous mental illness. This is perhaps the best known condition wherein a seemingly normal person, sound of mind, develops psychosis upon arrival in Jerusalem and can even feel that certain governments or agencies are after them due to their newfound religious significance. So, how prevalent is the condition, Jerusalem syndrome as a whole, amongst tourists? Well, statistically speaking, it's pretty insignificant. Over the span of 13 years, about 1,200 tourists developed some version of Jerusalem syndrome. 470 of which were admitted to a hospital for the condition. While that sounds like a lot, remember it's a total of 1,200 over a span of 13 years. And Jerusalem sees about 3.5 million tourists a year. So as I stated, the number overall is incredibly insignificant. And what makes type 3 even more interesting is that it's very different from types 1 and 2 in the sense that it has no subtypes, but instead specific criteria and stages. So we're going to jump into type 3 specifically. And this is probably the most common one. And one that you see and hear about a lot more in like mainstream media. The first criteria is that subjects suffering from type 3 Jerusalem syndrome have no previous history of mental illness or psychotic episodes. Essentially, they're as neurotypical as anybody can be. The second criteria is that these individuals aren't driven by a mission or purpose like types 1 and 2. It's not to find the true religion, cause an apocalyptic event, become a biblical character, or heal some terminal illness. Instead, these are normal tourists there to visit a historical site without special consideration to its religious significance or anything beyond that. They're just going to see a cool location. It's like visiting the Great Wall of China. You're just going to see it. You're like, wow, this is really, really cool. And you live the rest of your life like, oh yeah, I went there. It was kind of neat, but I didn't go there because I'm Christian or because I was seeking something important. I was there because I wanted to observe a historical site. The third and final criteria is that once these individuals arrive in Jerusalem, they suffer an acute psychotic episode that typically manifests in a series of 7 steps or stages. The following stages are described word for word by Bar L et al. So this is just taken specifically from the study. A, or 1, is anxiety, agitation, nervousness, and tension, plus other unspecified reactions. B, or 2, declaration of the desire to split away from the group or the family and to tour Jerusalem alone. Tourist guides aware of the Jerusalem syndrome and of the significance of such declarations may at this point refer the tourist to our institution for psychiatric evaluation in an attempt to preempt the subsequent stages of the syndrome. If unattended, these stages are usually unavoidable. 3, a need to be clean and pure, obsession with taking baths and showers, compulsive fingernail and toenail cutting. 4, preparation, often with the aid of hotel bed linen, of a long ankle-length toga-like gown, which is always white. 5, they need to scream, shout, or sing out loud psalms, verses from the Bible, religious hymns, or other spirituals. Manifestations of this type serve as a warning to hotel personnel and tourist guides, who should then attempt to have the tourist taken for professional treatment. Failing this, the last 2 stages will develop. 6, a procession or march to one of Jerusalem's holy places. And 7, delivery of a sermon in a holy place. The sermon is usually very confused and based on an unrealistic plea to humankind to adopt a more wholesome, moral, simple way of life. So how do you survive Jerusalem syndrome? Well, most people fall under type 3 and don't experience visual or auditory hallucinations like types 1 or 2 can. You're relatively safe. And in fact, most of the time, people return to normal within 5 to 7 days. And if you have underlying health concerns or psychotic issues, psychiatric help is probably the best form of treatment for Jerusalem syndrome. In most cases, when people recover from their Jerusalem syndrome, they're able to remember and recall their behaviors often, and they often have an extreme amount of guilt and are very, very embarrassed by their actions. It's important to note, however, that while most Jerusalem syndrome cases are harmless to others, save a few, it can be very detrimental to somebody's health. So much so that the psychosis can cause you to abandon common sense, like that of Oliver McAfee, a 2-year-old British tourist who remains missing to this day. Reports state that McAfee likely developed a severe case of Jerusalem syndrome that led him to vanishing off the face of the earth. A devout Christian, McAfee reportedly disappeared in the Negev desert of Israel. When hikers found McAfee's wallet, laptop, and keys, they handed the items over to authorities, which prompted a search. Reports state that amongst items later found belonging to McAfee was a Bible with torn pages and a series of notes. The pages and notes specifically pertained to the story of Jesus wandering the desert for 40 days, where he was tempted by the devil but ultimately triumphed. This made investigators believe that not only had McAfee fallen victim to Jerusalem syndrome, but that he deliberately walked out into the desert, presumably to replicate this specific Bible story. Remains were found in 2021, but no developments have been made. Sorry, good God, my tongue got tied. No developments have been made regarding McAfee, and the remains have not been ID'd as his. McAfee officially went missing in 2017, though some articles indicate it was 2018. This might be due to the fact that McAfee was last seen in November 21st at the end of the year and expected home in December before the new year, meaning that depending on established timelines, the events could overlap as no one knows exactly when he vanished. Now, as scary of a situation as that is, in recent years, cases of Jerusalem syndrome have actually gone down. It's something to still be cautious of and pay attention to if you visit Jerusalem with other people, family members, friends, whoever it may be, because the last thing you want is for somebody to end up the way that McAfee did. But like I said, in recent years, the cases have gone down. In the previous 50 years, cases were seen by In previous years, 50 cases were seen by the Israeli hospitals. Only about 2 to 3 occur each year in present day. It just so happened that McAfee was one of such a small statistic, meaning that you are likely to visit Jerusalem and come out otherwise fine. However, it's important, like I said, to recognize the illness both to protect yourself and others, because you never know who it could happen to, even if it isn't you. While it is still a small percentage, it is a percentage that still exists. And some people have really shitty luck, and who knows, it could definitely affect them or a family member. You could honestly keep a loved one from falling victim to psychosis in the way that McAfee most likely did. In all, Jerusalem syndrome is relatively harmless, save a few extreme cases. And what makes the syndrome so difficult is that its occurrence is something of a mystery, because research still struggles to understand what exactly causes obsessions and psychotic breaks surrounding the city of Jerusalem. It's likely that we'll never get a proper answer, and in truth, it's kind of unnerving to come to terms with. Some people may choose to believe that it's the trauma of the city manifesting itself, sort of like the residual haunting of a spirit. And some may choose to believe that it's just like a religious awakening, or something that somebody took too far as a religious awakening. You can speculate all you want about what causes it. In general, science is pretty baffled by it, but it exists nonetheless. And this means that overall, we're going to be kind of grasping for straws. And just know that if you go to Jerusalem, it's better to be safe than sorry. It's not that it can't happen. It can. It just most likely won't happen to you. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't keep an eye out for yourself and others. Because, like I said, who knows? The world is a very strange place, and the syndrome itself is incredibly weird. For accounts regarding Jerusalem syndrome, see the description. I've read a few articles, and it's actually quite fascinating hearing it firsthand from individuals who've experienced it. And it's interesting to read interviews of people who've suffered Jerusalem syndrome. And if you've enjoyed this video, please, like I said, leave a comment, like, subscribe, whatever really floats your boat. That's about it for Jerusalem syndrome. It's a very interesting case-by-case basis. It's not something that, like, I really knew about, because it is overall so minuscule statistically. But it does happen, and it affects everybody in a very different way. And I would love to see research kind of dive into, well, why does it affect certain people more than others? Is it because of mental illness? Is it because, like, you're particularly religious, and so you're more susceptible to seeing things and believing things? Very, very interesting. Again, like I said, we'll probably never know the real answer. It might just be one of Earth's greatest, weirdest mysteries, but I'm kind of on board for it. But yes, take care of each other if you're in Jerusalem. Don't do anything weird. Actually, listen, with the way that the world is right now, I probably wouldn't go to Jerusalem. There's a lot of weird shit happening there. Yeah, I'm not going to get into it too much, but very, very much a political hotspot, and a lot of violence, and just not great experiences. But if you are there, stay safe, take care of each other, and everybody in general, stay safe, stay vigilant, and stay psyched out.